What if the foods your Jewish grandmother spent all day simmering on the stove weren't just comfort food, but were quietly fighting the exact kind of inflammation modern medicine is still trying to figure out how to treat? Most people have no idea that while we're popping anti-inflammatory pills and chasing the latest gut health trend, Jewish kitchens, from the shtetls of Eastern Europe to the spice markets of Yemen, have been prescribing food as medicine for generations. And now, researchers are finally catching up to what was simmering in that pot the whole time. These aren't just your grandmother's old wives' tales or comfort food cliches. They're foods backed by real, peer-reviewed research. Compounds with names like oleocanthal, allicin, and punicalagin that scientists are now isolating in labs because of their power to shut down inflammation at the cellular level. And today, I'm going to show you 9 of them, pulled straight from generations of Jewish kitchens, that could completely change the way you think about food, your gut, and the chronic inflammation so many of us are quietly dealing with. Watch this video to the end, because number 5 on this list was once called a miracle food by Yemenite Jewish mothers, passed down through generations as the cure for everything from arthritis to fever, stirred into a paste and eaten by the spoonful whenever someone in the family got sick. For decades, it was dismissed by outsiders as folk medicine, the kind of thing you'd find in a grandmother's kitchen, but never in a pharmacy. And then researchers actually sat down and studied it. What they found wasn't folklore. It was a plant compound so potent at calming inflammation that some studies are now comparing its effects to drugs you'd need a prescription for. When we get there, I'll show you exactly what's inside it, and why an entire community built its health around a single jar of paste. But that's not even the one I'm most excited to tell you about. Number 9, the very last food on this list, is a spice blend so woven into Yemenite Jewish identity that it wasn't just cooked with, it was guarded like a family heirloom. Recipes were memorized, never written down, passed from mother to daughter, because the exact ratio of spices was considered part of the family's legacy. Most people watching this right now have never even heard of it, and when modern researchers finally broke down what's actually inside this blend, compound by compound, they were stunned. It's not one anti-inflammatory ingredient hiding in a spice jar. It's an entire pharmacy of them working together in a recipe regular people were making in their kitchens for generations. With zero idea, they were essentially dosing their families with one of the most concentrated anti-inflammatory blends in traditional medicine. Here's what's wild about both of these foods. They weren't created in a lab, they weren't marketed, they weren't sold with a health claim on the label. They survived because they worked. Sick child, Hilbe. Cold winter, achy joints, a body that needed warming and calming from the inside? The spice blend went into the pot. Nobody needed a clinical trial to tell them that. The proof was that their families kept doing it, generation after generation, in kitchens from Sana'a to Brooklyn. And that's really the thread connecting everything on this list. None of these 9 foods were chosen by Jewish communities because someone read a nutrition label. They were chosen because, over thousands of years of trial, error, displacement, and survival, certain foods kept showing up as the ones that helped, the ones that calmed a fever, the ones that settled a stomach, the ones that seemed to keep people going through illness, through poverty, through exile, through everything history threw at them. Modern science didn't create this knowledge, it's just now catching up to it, one peer-reviewed study at a time. So, if you've ever wondered why your grandmother insisted on that soup, or why that spice jar never left the stovetop, by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what was happening in that pot. Before we even get to number 1, I have to tell you, everything on this list comes from a tradition of healing that goes back nearly 1,000 years. And by the end of this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to access all of it. Keep watching. I am Rabbi Rafael, and if you want ancestral wisdom backed by real science, delivered straight to you every day, hit that subscribe button right now, because you don't want to miss what's coming. Everything on this list? 9 foods. That's what fits in a video. But the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, the physician who served the Sultan of Egypt 800 years ago, he didn't document 9. He documented over 60. 60 healing foods, herbs, and plants, with his own recorded prescriptions, covering everything from joint inflammation to blood sugar to blood pressure to mental clarity to sleep. There's one in the guide called nigella seed. Ketzach, it's called in the Bible, mentioned in the book of Isaiah. Modern pharmacology has spent years isolating the primary active compound inside it, called thymoquinone, specifically for anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. Isaiah named it. The Rambam used it. Scientists are now publishing papers on it, and almost nobody who grew up in a Western kitchen has ever put it in a pot. That's what the Rambam Healing Bible is. Every one of those 60 remedies, in plain language, with the science alongside it, organized by condition, so if you're dealing with joint pain or gut issues or anything else, you find your answer in under 2 minutes. I will tell you more about this Bible before we end. Let's get started. 1. Chicken soup, the original Jewish penicillin. Let's start with the food that practically every Jewish person on earth has been handed by their mother, grandmother, or great-aunt the moment they so much as sniffled. Chicken soup isn't just comfort food in Jewish culture. It's medicine. It has a name, Jewish penicillin. Mothers and grandmothers have been ladling it out for sick children and ailing husbands for as long as anyone can remember, with total, unshakable confidence that it actually worked. Not as a placebo, not as a nice gesture, as treatment. And here's what modern science says. They were right. Researchers actually put chicken soup under a microscope, literally, to figure out why it seemed to help people recover from colds and respiratory infections faster. One of the most cited studies found that chicken soup inhibits neutrophil chemotaxis in a lab setting, meaning it slows down the migration of certain inflammatory immune cells that, left unchecked, contribute to the swelling, congestion, and misery of a cold. In plain terms, the soup doesn't just feel soothing going down. It appears to be calming an overactive inflammatory response in real time. Later research went further, looking at the immunomodulatory effects of chicken soup made from different kinds of chickens, and even reviewed its relevance during the COVID era, when researchers were re-examining old home remedies for clues about supporting the immune system through respiratory illness. But here's the distinction that matters. Not all chicken soup is created equal, and this is where quality separates the medicine from the placebo. Researchers found that soup made from native, cage-free chickens showed stronger immunomodulatory effects than soup made from commercial, caged broilers. That tracks with what Jewish home cooks have always done instinctively. A real, slow-simmered broth, made from a whole bird with bones, vegetables, and thyme. Not a bouillon cube and hot water. The penicillin effect isn't in the salt or the noodles. It's in what gets extracted from real bones and real meat over hours of low, patient heat. The traditional use is exactly what you'd expect. A whole chicken, simmered for hours with onion, carrot, celery, and garlic into a clear golden broth, served at the first sign of a cold, a fever, or simply because someone in the family needed warming up and looking after. Some traditions add matzo balls. Others lean into Yemenite-style chicken soup, which goes a step further, building in turmeric, garlic, and fenugreek directly into the broth, stacking anti-inflammatory ingredients on top of an already anti-inflammatory base. We'll get to why that combination is so powerful later on this list. This is the food that has comforted generations of Jewish families through illness, exile, poverty, and everything in between. It didn't need a clinical trial to earn its reputation. It earned it one sick child, one recovered grandfather, one Friday night at a time. Science just spent the last few decades proving what was already obvious to anyone who grew up with a bowl placed in front of them and a voice saying, "Eat, you'll feel better." 2. Olive oil, the liquid gold of the Jewish table. Long before it was a wellness buzzword, Olive oil was simply what Jewish life ran on. In Israel, across the Mediterranean diaspora, in the kitchens of Sephardic and Mizrahi families, for whom olive oil wasn't a finishing touch, it was the foundation of nearly every dish, used for frying, for dressing, for dipping bread, for lighting lamps. It was food, fuel, and tradition rolled into one bottle. And here's what modern science says: that instinct to pour it on everything wasn't just culinary habit, it was, functionally, medicine. The compound responsible is called oleocanthal, a polyphenol found specifically in high-quality, fresh, extra virgin olive oil. Researchers studying oleocanthal discovered something remarkable. It inhibits the same inflammatory pathway, the COX enzymes, that ibuprofen targets. That's not a loose comparison. Studies have specifically measured oleocanthal's pharmacology against ibuprofen and found a genuinely similar anti-inflammatory mechanism. Other research has gone further, showing oleocanthal helping prevent inflammation and oxidative stress in models of autoimmune arthritis, and even exploring its potential role against certain cancer cells and neuroinflammation linked to conditions like Alzheimer's. But here's the quality distinction that changes everything. Not all olive oil delivers this effect. Oleocanthal is fragile and concentrated specifically in fresh, high polyphenol, cold-pressed extra virgin olive oil, the kind that, when you taste it, gives you that distinctive peppery bite at the back of your throat. That bite is actually the oleocanthal itself irritating your throat receptors, which is why scientists use it as a rough field test for potency. The pale, refined, heavily processed olive oil sitting in a lot of pantries today has often lost much of that. Cheaper bottles are frequently cut with neutral seed oils and bear little resemblance, chemically, to the oil that built the Mediterranean diet's reputation in the first place. The traditional use is simple, and it's exactly how Jewish households have always treated it: a generous daily pour over vegetables, into soups, drizzled raw over finished dishes rather than only used for high-heat cooking, since some of those delicate polyphenols degrade with prolonged heat. A piece of bread dipped straight in, the way it's been eaten at Sabbath tables for generations. This is a food that never needed a marketing campaign to earn its place in Jewish kitchens. It earned it through thousands of years of being the thing every dish started with. And modern researchers, compound by compound, keep confirming there was a very good reason it stuck around that long. 3. Garlic. The food the Israelites cried over. It's actually in the Torah. Wandering in the wilderness eating manna, the Israelites famously mourned the foods they left behind in Egypt, and garlic makes the list, right alongside fish, cucumbers, melons, and onions. They missed it enough to weep about it, and if you understand what garlic actually does inside the body, that kind of grief starts to make a lot more sense. Garlic has carried its reputation as a near-mythical health food through nearly every Jewish culinary tradition. Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi. It shows up everywhere, in everything, in serious quantities. And here's what modern science says: that instinct wasn't superstition. The compound responsible is called allicin, created the moment garlic is crushed, chopped, or chewed. Researchers studying allicin have found it has a meaningful effect on hypertension and cardiac function, particularly relevant for people managing chronic kidney disease, where inflammation and blood pressure regulation are closely linked. Other research has shown garlic's organosulfur compounds support vascular health more broadly, helping explain why garlic shows up again and again in studies on blood pressure and cardiovascular inflammation. There's even research showing garlic helps regulate inflammation and reduce cellular damage in models of muscle injury, evidence that its anti-inflammatory reach goes well beyond the cardiovascular system. But here's the quality distinction that matters. Allicin doesn't exist in garlic until you damage the clove. It's created by an enzymatic reaction the moment you crush or chop it, and it's also volatile, meaning it breaks down with heat and with time. The bottled, pre-minced garlic sitting in a lot of refrigerators, or the garlic powder in a spice rack, has often lost much of what made fresh garlic so potent in the first place. There's even a known technique, sometimes called the hack and hold method, where you deliberately crush garlic and let it sit for several minutes before cooking, specifically to maximize allicin formation before heat destroys it. The traditional use lines up with that science almost exactly: garlic crushed and added at the very end of cooking, or eaten raw, finely minced into dressings, dips, and preserves. Generations of Jewish cooks who insisted on fresh garlic, chopped by hand, right before it hit the pan, weren't being fussy. They were unknowingly preserving the exact compound researchers would spend decades studying. This is the food an entire community once cried over losing. Modern science has spent the years since explaining, compound by compound, exactly why that loss felt so significant. Pomegranate, the jeweled fruit of Jewish tradition. Pomegranates are everywhere in Jewish symbolism, carved into the architecture of the ancient temple, eaten on Rosh Hashanah as a symbol of abundance and the hope for a year as full of good deeds as the fruit is full of seeds. Some traditions even count exactly how many seeds are inside, treating the number itself as meaningful. This wasn't a decorative choice. A fruit doesn't get woven into a culture's holiest rituals by accident. And here's what modern science says. The symbolism of abundance turns out to describe the fruit's chemistry almost perfectly. Pomegranates contain a compound called punicalagin, found in extraordinarily high concentrations in the fruit's juice, seeds, and especially its rind. Researchers studying punicalagin have documented its physiological and immune functions, showing it actively interferes with major inflammatory signaling pathways in the body. Once you eat it, gut bacteria break punicalagin down further into compounds called urolithins, and this is where the research gets genuinely exciting. Studies have shown urolithin A inhibits NF-kappa B activation, one of the body's central inflammatory switches, in immune cells exposed to bacterial triggers. Related research has found that pomegranate's ellagic acid and urolithin, A metabolites, actually strengthen the tight junctions that hold your intestinal lining together, meaning this fruit may help reinforce the gut barrier itself, not just calm inflammation after the fact. A broader review specifically examined pomegranate's anti-inflammatory activity in the gastrointestinal tract, and found consistent, mechanism-backed support across multiple inflammatory pathways. But here's the quality distinction most people miss. The part with the strongest concentration of these compounds is the part almost everyone throws away: the rind. Commercial pomegranate juice extracted and bottled for supermarket shelves captures only a fraction of what's available in the whole fruit, and definitely none of what's in the peel. Traditional Middle Eastern and Sephardic preparations that use dried rind weren't working around a flaw in the fruit. They were using the most medicinally concentrated part of it. The traditional use reflects that, eating the seeds fresh, drinking freshly pressed juice, rather than the processed bottled kind, and in some traditional preparations, steeping the dried rind into a tea, particularly for gut complaints. It's slower to eat than most fruit. Extracting those seeds takes patience. But that effort has always been part of the point: a fruit reserved for the holiest day of the year, rewarding the work of eating it with something researchers are still working to fully map out. 5. Hilbe, the one I teased at the beginning. This is Fenugreek, prepared the Yemenite Jewish way: soaked, ground, and whipped into a thick, frothy, slightly bitter paste called Hilbe. For generations, Yemenite Jewish families have treated it as something close to a miracle food, spooned out for fevers, joint pain, digestive trouble, basically anything that ailed someone in the house. It wasn't a side condiment. It was reached for the way you'd reach for medicine. And here's what modern science says. The miracle food reputation has real chemistry behind it. Fenugreek seeds are loaded with bioactive flavonoids and an unusually high fiber content, and researchers have spent years documenting its anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects. One study specifically examined fenugreek's role in preventing inflammation in a mouse model of Alzheimer's disease, finding meaningful antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects on brain tissue. evidence that fenugreek's reach may extend well beyond the joints and gut it's traditionally used for. Other research, including reviews on fenugreek as a feed additive, has consistently identified antipyretic, fever-reducing, and anti-inflammatory properties in its seed compounds. And one of the defining characteristics of fenugreek, well documented in traditional and analytical sources alike, is its mucilaginous quality. When soaked, it forms a gel-like substance that coats and soothes the digestive tract, which lines up precisely with why it's been used for centuries to settle upset stomachs and inflamed guts. But here's the quality distinction. Hilbe has to be made fresh. The seeds are soaked, often for a full day, then ground and whipped, sometimes with garlic, chili, and cilantro folded into that signature frothy paste. The process itself matters. Dried, pre-ground fenugreek powder sitting in a spice jar for months doesn't deliver the same fresh, mucilaginous froth texture and potency as Hilbe made the traditional way, right before it's eaten. The traditional use is exactly what Yemenite Jewish households have done for generations: a spoonful of fresh Hilbe stirred directly into soup, often the same chicken soup we talked about earlier, stacking anti-inflammatory ingredients on top of each other in a single bowl. It's also spread on bread, or eaten alongside other dips at the Sabbath table. The taste is sharp and bitter, the kind of bitterness that, in herbal medicine, usually signals something is actively doing work. This is the food an entire community quietly built its home remedy cabinet around, long before anyone had isolated a single compound inside it. Researchers are still catching up to what was already obvious in Yemenite kitchens: that bitter little paste was never just a condiment. And here's the thing, Hilbe is just one of hundreds of remedies the Rambam documented. Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, one of the greatest physician scholars in Jewish history, spent his entire life cataloging these exact healing foods, these plants, these preparations that kept Jewish communities alive and thriving across centuries of exile and hardship. And most of that wisdom has been sitting in texts most people will never read, in a language most people don't speak. That's why I put together something I call the Rambam Healing Bible, a complete guide to the ancient Jewish healing foods, herbs, and remedies, all gathered and translated into plain language you can actually use. Not a list of supplements to buy, not a trend, just the same foods these communities have relied on for thousands of years, explained with the science that's now confirming why they worked. And here's what makes this different from anything else out there. When you get the guide, you're not just getting a PDF and being left alone with it. You're getting lifetime access to my private inner circle. Every single week, I share new discoveries directly with members. New foods, new remedies, new research on the ancient Jewish approaches to healing that I'm still uncovering. Things that won't make it to a YouTube video. Things that get shared first with the people inside. One purchase. Lifetime access. No subscriptions, no renewal fees. Just first-hand, ongoing access to everything I find. The link to get in is pinned in the first comment, it's in the description below, and if you're watching, you can scan the QR code on screen right now. We'll get back to the list, but I didn't want you to get to the end of this video without knowing that path exists. 6. Beetroot, the deep red root that shows up at nearly every Jewish holiday table. Borscht, pickled beets. Crane mixed with beets for that distinctive pink horseradish condiment at Passover. Beetroot runs through Ashkenazi Jewish cuisine in particular, often dismissed by outsiders as just an old-world, peasant vegetable. Earthy, unglamorous, the kind of thing that stains your fingers and your cutting board. But the deep red color that makes beets so messy to work with turns out to be exactly where their power lives. And here's what modern science says. That pigment isn't just visual, it's biologically active. The compounds responsible are called betalains, the same pigments that give beetroot its vivid color, Researchers studying betalains have found they reduce systemic inflammation effectively enough that beetroot is now being explored as a functional feed additive, specifically because of its anti-inflammatory potential. Other studies have zeroed in on individual betalain compounds, betanin, vulgaxanthin, indicaxanthin, and compared their radical scavenging and immunomodulatory effects on intestinal cells, finding meaningful differences in potency between them, but consistent anti-inflammatory activity across the board. A separate, more specific review focused on the neuroprotective potential of betalains, highlighting their anti-inflammatory effects in the context of brain health. Research on gomphoranin, a closely related pigment compound, has shown similar anti-inflammatory activity in other red pigmented plants, reinforcing that this isn't a one-off finding tied to a single study. But here's the quality distinction. Betalains are heat-sensitive and water-soluble, meaning the way you cook beets matters enormously. Boiling beets in a large pot of water and discarding the liquid pulls a meaningful portion of those pigments, and their associated benefits, right down the drain. Traditional preparations that roast beets, or that use the cooking liquid itself, as classic borscht does, preserve far more of what makes the vegetable functionally useful, not just decorative. The traditional use reflects exactly that instinct. Beets roasted whole in their skins, simmered into borscht, where the broth itself is consumed rather than discarded, or pickled, a preparation that, as we'll see with the next food on this list, brings its own additional anti-inflammatory benefit on top of the betalains already present. This is the vegetable generations of Jewish families have been quietly staining their hands with at every holiday table, never needing a lab to tell them it belonged there. Science is only now starting to explain, pigment by pigment, what that deep red color was actually doing. 7. Pickles. The deli staple that's actually a gut health powerhouse in disguise. Every Jewish deli has the same iconic image, a barrel of half-sours sitting by the counter, free pickles dropped onto the table the moment you sit down. It feels like tradition for tradition's sake, a crunchy garnish, a nostalgic touch. But the specific way Jewish delis have always made their pickles, through real fermentation rather than just vinegar and brine, turns out to be doing something far more significant than adding crunch. And here's what modern science says. Real fermentation changes the food itself, not just the flavor. There's an important distinction researchers draw here between pickled and fermented foods. Vinegar-pickled foods are acidified, which preserves them but doesn't meaningfully transform their nutritional profile. True fermented pickles, the kind made the traditional Jewish deli way, in salt brine, left to ferment naturally, undergo a process that actually creates new anti-inflammatory phytochemicals and live probiotic bacteria that weren't present in the raw cucumber. That distinction matters enormously because it's the live bacteria and the fermentation byproducts, not the cucumber itself, that drive most of the health effect. Research into probiotics more broadly has shown that the beneficial bacteria found in fermented foods can lower systemic inflammation, with effects that extend even to mental and neurological health, an area researchers are still actively mapping out. But here's the quality distinction that separates a real deli pickle from most of what's on supermarket shelves. The vast majority of commercial pickles today are pasteurized and vinegar-based, which kills off any live bacteria and skips the fermentation process entirely. They taste similar, they are not biologically the same food. A genuinely fermented pickle, salt-brined, naturally soured, never pasteurized, is a living food, the same way raw honey or unheated olive oil are living foods. Once it's pasteurized for shelf stability, that's gone. The traditional use is essentially unchanged from the deli counter, naturally fermented half-sours or full sours, eaten alongside meals the way they always have been, valued as much for what they do for digestion as for their taste. Some traditional households even drink a small amount of the leftover brine itself, instinctively treating it as a tonic rather than waste. This is the food sitting in a barrel by the door of nearly every Jewish deli in the world, treated as an afterthought, a free side. Research into fermentation is increasingly suggesting it deserves to be treated as one of the main events. 8. Horseradish. The bitter herb that earns its place at the table once a year and turns out to deserve it far more often. Horseradish, ground into crane, is one of the bitter herbs eaten at the Passover Seder, a deliberate, ritual reminder of the bitterness of slavery in Egypt. It's meant to sting, it's meant to make you feel something, and for thousands of years, that sharp, eye-watering bite has been treated as purely symbolic, a flavor chosen for its intensity, nothing more. And here's what modern science says. That intensity isn't incidental. It's the active ingredient. The compound responsible for horseradish's sharp bite is called allyl isothiocyanate, or ATC, released when the root is grated or crushed, the same family of pungent compounds found in mustard and wasabi. Researchers studying IT have found it has genuine anti-inflammatory properties, and one recent study went further, identifying that IT appears to ameliorate liver disease specifically through its action on vitamin D receptors in liver cells, a mechanism connecting horseradish's bite to inflammation control deep inside the body, far beyond the sinuses it clears at the Seder table. Separate research has investigated IT as a cancer chemopreventive phytochemical, examining how readily the body absorbs and uses these compounds once they're consumed. And in diabetic rat models, ITC measurably reduced inflammatory and oxidative stress markers, suggesting its anti-inflammatory reach extends into metabolic health as well. Other research has pointed to IT working through the NRF2 pathway, one of the body's master regulators of antioxidant and anti-inflammatory defense. But here's the quality distinction. That sting is the active compound, and it's fragile. AT forms the moment horseradish is grated and exposed to air, and it degrades over time and with heat. The jarred, pre-prepared horseradish that's been sitting in a refrigerator for months has typically lost much of the punch, and the chemistry that fresh grated root delivers. The Seder ritual of grating it fresh, right before the meal, and watching everyone's eyes water, isn't just for theatrical effect. It's the only way to get it at full strength. The traditional use lines up with that ritual exactly. Horseradish root grated fresh, mixed with beets into crane, or eaten plain as one of the bitter herbs. Consumed in small, intense quantities rather than large ones, the way potent medicine usually is. This is a food chosen deliberately for its bitterness, meant to make people remember something hard. Modern science is now suggesting that same bitterness has been quietly doing something good for the body the entire time. 9. Hawaij, the guarded family recipe that was secretly a pharmacy. I saved this for the last because it might be the most extraordinary food on this entire list. In Yemenite Jewish households, Hawaij wasn't just a spice blend, it was a family secret. The exact ratio, cumin, black pepper, turmeric, cardamom, sometimes coriander or cloves, depending on whose grandmother you asked, was rarely written down. It was memorized, guarded, passed from mother to daughter the way a family heirloom gets passed down, because in a sense, that's exactly what it was. There's even a version made specifically for coffee, separate from the savory soup version, each with its own closely held ratio. Most people watching this have never even heard the word. And here's what modern science says. This wasn't just flavor being protected. It was an entire pharmacy hiding in a spice jar. Hawaij isn't one anti-inflammatory ingredient. It's several, stacked deliberately together. Cumin has documented digestive and blood sugar benefits. Black pepper increases the bioavailability of other compounds it's paired with. Turmeric's curcumin is one of the most studied anti-inflammatory compounds in existence, and cardamom and coriander each bring their own anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties to the blend. Hawaij itself has deep roots in Yemeni history, used not just to flavor food, but specifically valued for its effects on immunity and digestion, which is exactly why it shows up so often, stirred directly into Yemenite chicken soup, the same soup we talked about as item 1, turning an already anti-inflammatory broth into something layered with 4 or 5 active compounds working at once. That's the detail that should stop you. An entire community was building combination therapy-level anti-inflammatory meals generations before anyone had a word for synergistic effects, simply because the soup tasted better and the family stayed healthier when Hawaij went in. Here's the quality distinction, and it's the one that matters most on this entire list. Hawaij has to be ground fresh, and the ratio has to be right. A generic, mass-produced Middle Eastern spice blend off a supermarket shelf is not the same thing as a Hawaij recipe carried across oceans and guarded for generations. The freshness of the grind affects potency. The ratio affects which compounds dominate. This is a recipe, not a commodity, and that's precisely why families fought to keep their version intact. The traditional use is simple on the surface and profound underneath. A spoonful stirred into chicken soup, into stews, into rice, even into coffee. A pinch here, a pinch there, every single day, in nearly every savory dish a Yemenite Jewish household made. Nobody was taking a supplement. They were just cooking dinner the way their mother taught them. And here's the thread that ties this entire list together. None of these 9 foods, the soup, the oil, the garlic, the pomegranate, the Hilbe, the beets, the pickles, the horseradish, and now this spice blend guarded like treasure, were chosen because anyone read a study. They survived because, generation after generation, through exile and poverty and everything history threw at Jewish communities across the world, they kept working. The science didn't create this wisdom. It's just now catching up to explain it. Sometimes the recipe nobody wrote down is the recipe that mattered most. 9 foods, generations of use, centuries of wisdom that almost got lost the moment processed. Convenient, shelf-stable alternatives showed up and made the real versions feel old-fashioned. Here's what I want you to take away from this. The Jewish families who built these recipes, who guarded these ratios, who insisted on the fresh garlic and the slow-simmered broth, weren't being old-fashioned or superstitious. They were paying attention. They watched what helped a sick child recover, what settled an upset stomach, what kept a body going through poverty, through exile, through everything history threw at them, and they built it into their kitchens, their holidays, and their rituals. And now modern science, with its clinical trials and its biochemical analysis, keeps arriving at the same conclusions they reached generations ago, just with better instruments. Chicken soup calms inflammatory immune cells. Olive oil works like a natural ibuprofen. Garlic supports healthy blood pressure and reduces cellular damage. Pomegranate strengthens the gut lining and quiets inflammatory signaling. Hilbe soothes the digestive tract and calms fevers. Beetroot's pigments fight inflammation at a cellular level. Real fermented pickles deliver live bacteria that lower systemic inflammation. Horseradish's bite is doing real metabolic work. And Hawaij stacks 4 or 5 anti-inflammatory compounds into a single spoonful, the way families have done it for generations, without ever calling it stacking. The recipe was right. It just didn't need to explain the mechanism, because the mechanism wasn't the point. The food was the point. The healing was the point. Before I let you go, I want to make sure you actually have a path forward, because information without action is just entertainment. 9 foods. And these 9 are just the beginning. The Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, documented hundreds of healing foods, plants, and remedies across his lifetime as both a physician and a scholar. Most of that wisdom never made it to a YouTube channel. Most of it never got a Netflix documentary. It survived the way Hilbe survived and the way Hawaij survived, quietly, passed down within communities, buried inside texts that most people will never find. I've spent years gathering it. And I put it all into the Rambam Healing Bible. Every healing food, every herb, every remedy, he documented, translated into plain language, with the modern science alongside it, so you understand not just what to eat, but why it works. But here's what I want you to understand about this offer. It's not just a guide. When you get it, you get lifetime access to my inner circle, a private membership where every single week I bring you new findings directly, new foods, new preparations, new research confirming what the Rambam and the Jewish healing tradition already knew. The people in that membership get this information first, before it becomes a video, before it becomes a trend. Buy it once. Get it for life. No recurring fee. No subscription. Just ongoing access to everything I find, for as long as I'm researching it. The link is pinned in the first comment below. It's also in the description. And if you're watching right now, scan the QR code on screen. Takes 10 seconds and gets you in immediately. The recipe was right all along. Now you have the full book. And I have to be honest with you, quality matters enormously here. The difference between a real, slow-simmered bone broth and a bouillon cube. Between fresh grated horseradish and the jar that's been in your fridge since last Passover. Between a naturally fermented half-sour and a pasteurized supermarket pickle that just tastes similar. It's not a small difference. It's the difference between food that's actually doing something and food that's just nostalgic. Drop a comment and tell me which food on this list surprised you the most. Are you team chicken soup, team Hawaii, or team I had no idea pickles were doing all that? I read every single comment. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and ring the bell so you never miss what's coming next. See you in the next one.